To most of the galaxy, humans were a puzzle wrapped in contradictions and topped with an annoying dose of optimism. They were resourceful yet reckless, empathetic yet competitive, and, above all, gentle. Or so the Galactic Council thought. When humanity joined the Council, their reputation as peaceful negotiators spread quickly. Alien delegates marveled at their willingness to mediate disputes, share resources, and collaborate on interstellar projects. If galactic diplomacy had a favorite child, it was humanity, and they were positively glowing with the praise. And then the topic of warfare came up. It started innocently enough during a cultural exchange program aboard the Galactic Council station. Delegates from dozens of species had gathered in a grand domed chamber that glimmered with holographic stars. The air buzzed with polite chatter as representatives discussed topics ranging from art to agriculture. At one end of the chamber stood Sergeant Jacob Thorne, a human soldier in his late 30s. His short-cropped brown hair and angular features gave him an unassuming presence, though the crisp uniform and steely gaze hinted at someone who'd seen more than his fair share of battlefields. Thorne had been asked to attend as a human cultural representative for military matters, a title he wore with reluctant pride. Standing beside him was Cal Thavik, an amphibious delegate with translucent blue skin and an unquenchable curiosity about Earth. "So, Sergeant Thorne," Cal Thavik began, his voice a series of lilting chirps translated into perfect English by his vocal modulator. "Why does humanity have, what do you call them? Rules for war?" The question was delivered with genuine curiosity, but Thorne stiffened. Around the chamber, other alien delegates turned their attention to the conversation. Their expressions ranged from mild interest to mild amusement. Thorne cleared his throat. "Rules of engagement, you mean?" "Yes, yes." Cal Thavik's bulbous eyes glimmered with excitement. "This concept is fascinating to us. Why would anyone impose rules on war? War is chaos, is it not?" Thorne opened his mouth to answer but paused. "How do you explain the necessity of rules to beings who saw war as nothing more than natural selection writ large?" "Let me ask you this," Thorne said, leaning slightly on the podium. "Have you ever heard of something called a war crime?" The room went silent. Thorne scanned the crowd. The Lunaxians, a race of crystalline beings, tilted their heads in unison, their refracting light patterns suggesting confusion. The insectoid Vrikra delegate, who had 6 arms and an intimidating chittering voice, leaned forward expectantly. Even the stoic Rinthar ambassador, whose species prided itself on strategic perfection in battle, narrowed his 3 glowing eyes with interest. "I'll take that as a no," Thorne said, sighing. "All right. A war crime is when someone crosses the line in combat, when they commit an act so horrific, so unethical, that even in the middle of a war, it's considered unacceptable." "Unacceptable," Rinthar Ambassador Zorveth boomed, his deep, echoing voice tinged with skepticism. "In war, the strong survive, and the weak perish. What could possibly be unacceptable?" "Oh, you'd be surprised," Thorne said with a grim smile. "Let's start with chemical weapons. You know, gases designed to melt flesh or cause uncontrollable bleeding. We banned those." Cal Thavik's head tilted. "You banned gas? Why?" "Because it's horrible," Thorne replied bluntly. "And because we figured out there were less messy ways to kill people." The room erupted in murmurs. Thorne noticed a jellyfish-like delegate pulsating nervously in its water-filled hover chamber. A feathered alien squawked in what he assumed was alarm. "And that's just the tip of the iceberg," Thorne continued, his tone measured but unflinching. "We've also banned biological weapons, which use engineered diseases to kill indiscriminately. And nukes. Well, those are technically allowed, but only in extreme cases. The radiation tends to ruin the neighborhood for a few millennia." Cal Thavik's glimmering skin dulled slightly. "You've used these things?" "Not me, personally," Thorne said. But humans? Yeah. We used nuclear weapons to end a war once. Killed hundreds of thousands of people in seconds. The fallout poisoned the land for decades. That's why we try not to use them anymore. The murmurs grew louder, and several alien delegates began whispering frantically to their aides. Why would you develop such atrocities if you find them so abhorrent? Zorveth asked, his tone sharp. Thorne's expression hardened. Because war isn't clean, and because if we didn't develop them, someone else would. Humanity learned early on that you either set the rules or get crushed by someone who doesn't care about them. Fascinating, Kalthavik said softly, though his wide eyes betrayed discomfort. And these rules, do they prevent such horrors from happening? Thorne hesitated. Not always, but they give us a line to draw, a way to hold people accountable when they go too far. He glanced at the crowd. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. The room fell into an uneasy silence. For the first time, the Galactic Council saw a side of humanity that wasn't wrapped in diplomacy or kindness. Thorne wasn't just a soldier. He was a representative of a species that had stared into the abyss of its own brutality and decided to make rules to survive it. Kalthavik's voice broke the silence. Humans are not what I expected. Thorne gave a small, bitter laugh. No, we never are. The atmosphere in the Galactic Council chamber had shifted. The curiosity that had filled the room moments earlier had been replaced by an uneasy tension, the kind that arises when a seemingly harmless creature suddenly bares its teeth. Sergeant Jacob Thorne, now fully aware of the weight his words carried, took a slow sip from the water bottle on the podium. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. This was just the reality he had lived. And now, it seemed, the rest of the galaxy was about to live it too. Kalthavik broke the silence, his voice quieter this time. Sergeant, you mentioned accountability for these war crimes. How does one even begin to regulate chaos? Thorne straightened, his expression hardening. With difficulty, Delegate Kalthavik. Humanity didn't figure it out overnight, and we still don't always get it right. But we've tried, starting with something we call the Geneva Conventions. The what? A crystalline delegate from the Lenaxian Accord asked, their light-reflecting body refracting into puzzled rainbows. The Geneva Conventions, Thorne repeated, a set of agreements humanity created to limit the suffering caused by war. They lay out rules like, don't target civilians, don't torture prisoners, and don't use certain types of weapons. Rinthar Ambassador Zorveth crossed his arms, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the smaller delegates near him. Your species willingly limits its own strategic options. That seems inefficient. It is, Thorne admitted, but it's also necessary. Without those limits, war stops being a tool of strategy and becomes pure savagery. Believe me, we've seen what happens when there are no rules. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Thorne leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but edged with something raw. Ever heard of a place called Nanking? No? Didn't think so. It was a city on Earth where one side in a war decided to throw out the rules. Civilians tortured, murdered, women assaulted on a scale so massive it still turns stomachs centuries later. And it wasn't the only time. My people have a long, bloody history of crossing lines before we learn to draw them. Kalthavik's luminous eyes blinked slowly, as if trying to process what he'd just heard. You speak of these atrocities so plainly. Thorne exhaled sharply through his nose. Because they're facts. Pretending they didn't happen doesn't erase them. Facing them is the only way we learn to stop repeating them. Mostly. A feathered alien delegate, her plumage shimmering in hues of gold and red, raised a cautious wing. And what happens when these rules are broken? What do humans do then? War crimes trials, Thorne said. After the fighting stops, the people responsible are brought to court. They're judged, and if found guilty, punished. The delegate tilted her head, feathers rippling. Punished how? Prison. Sometimes execution, Thorne said bluntly. Depends on the crime. The murmurs started again, louder this time. Aliens who had thought of war as little more than survival tactics were now grappling with the idea of post-war accountability. And these trials, Zorveth rumbled, his glowing eyes narrowing, are they always fair? Or do the victors merely punish the vanquished? Thorne hesitated. It was a valid question, and one he couldn't sugarcoat. They're not perfect, he admitted. Sometimes justice gets twisted into vengeance. But we try. It's better than letting everyone walk away scot-free after committing atrocities. Zorveth studied him for a moment, then gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Calthavik, however, wasn't ready to let the topic drop. Sergeant, your species created rules for war. You even punish those who break them. But you also said there were limits you yourselves crossed before these rules existed. Could you elaborate? Thorne's jaw tightened. He could see where this was going, and he didn't like it. But he'd started this conversation, and he wasn't about to leave it half-finished. There are plenty of examples, he said. But if you want one that really drives the point home, let's talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The room waited, silent and expectant. During a global war, humans developed a weapon unlike anything the galaxy has ever seen. A single bomb that could wipe out an entire city in seconds. We used 2 of them, hundreds of thousands dead, and the fallout poisoned the land and people for decades. Several delegates recoiled visibly. Even the normally stoic Zorveth seemed taken aback. You used such a weapon, Calthavik whispered, his translucent skin dimming. On your own planet? Yes, Thorne said, his voice heavy. And it ended the war. But it also taught us how far we were willing to go to win. That's when we realized we needed limits, because without them, we'd destroy ourselves. The silence that followed was suffocating. One by one, the alien delegates began to shift uncomfortably. They were beginning to see humanity not as the gentle mediators they'd believed, but as something far more complex and far more dangerous. Calthavik finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. Sergeant Thorne, your people have walked the edge of annihilation and pulled back. I am unsure whether to respect you or fear you. Why not both? Thorne said, his tone dry but his expression tired. The session was officially adjourned, but no one left the chamber. The Galactic Council's delegates, each representing their respective species, remained frozen in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances and whispered conversations. The serene order of the council was gone, replaced by a palpable tension that clung to the air like static. Sergeant Jacob Thorne stood at the podium, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, though he caught flickers of alien expressions that ranged from awe to outright fear. This wasn't how he'd wanted the cultural exchange to go, but sugarcoating humanity's past wasn't an option. A diminutive alien delegate from the Quarren Collective, whose appearance resembled a bioluminescent sea slug, floated to the edge of its gravity chair. Its soft, glowing voice carried a tremble as it spoke. Human Thorne, forgive my bluntness, but how does your species continue? How do you live with such a history? Thorne's shoulders relaxed slightly. This was a question he could answer honestly. We live with it because we have to, he said. We don't ignore our history. We study it, teach it, and try to make sure the next generation learns from our mistakes. And yeah, sometimes we fail. But humanity didn't get to the stars by pretending we were perfect. We got here by figuring out how to survive our own flaws. The alien seemed to dim slightly, deep in thought, before retreating to its seat. Ambassador Zorveth of the Rinthar stepped forward, his towering form casting long shadows. Sergeant Thorne, I must ask, you speak of rules and accountability, yet you freely admit to breaking them. Does this not make your kind hypocrites? Thorne met Zorveth's glowing gaze without flinching. Yeah, it does, he said plainly. But the thing about humans? We learn through failure. A lot of it. Rules don't work because they're perfect. They work because people believe in them enough to try. And sometimes, trying is the best we've got. The Rinthar ambassador tilted his head, as if the concept of failure being integral to growth was utterly alien to him. Calthavik leaned forward again, his translucent skin glowing faintly. But Sergeant, your history suggests a capacity for destruction unparalleled in this council's history. How can we trust that such power will not one day be turned upon us? Thorne's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew this question would come, but it still hit harder than he expected. You can't, he admitted. Not completely. Trust isn't something you get with words, it's earned through action. And right now, humanity's actions are what brought us here, to this council, trying to make things better. You've seen our worst, you've heard about our mistakes, but you've also seen what we're capable of when we focus on progress. That's all I can offer, progress. The murmurs around the chamber grew louder. Delegates whispered in their own languages, translators working overtime to keep up. For some, Thorne's words were a revelation. For others, they were a warning. A jellyfish-like delegate from the Zelthari drift hovered closer to Thorne, its tentacles pulsing faintly. Your honesty is unsettling. Most species hide their atrocities, yet you lay them bare. Why? Thorne gave a small, rueful smile. Because hiding the truth never helps. If we bury the worst parts of ourselves, they come back worse. Humanity learned that the hard way. The Zelthari delegate retreated, leaving the room in contemplative silence. Then, an unexpected voice broke through. I disagree, said a diminutive, furry delegate from the Tinks Empire, whose appearance resembled an oversized, sentient chinchilla. Humans are dangerous. Their history is proof that they are a threat to galactic peace. Several delegates nodded in agreement, their expressions darkening. Calthavik turned to the Tinks representative, his voice rising. And yet, they are here, sharing their knowledge. Would we deny them a place in the council simply because they are flawed? If so, then none of us deserve to be here. The chamber erupted in debate, voices overlapping in a cacophony of opinions. Some supported Calthavik's defense, while others sided with the Tinks delegate, arguing that humanity's potential for destruction outweighed their contributions. Thorne stood silently, letting the chaos unfold. This wasn't a battle he could fight. Humanity's future in the Council would depend on how the galaxy chose to interpret their past. After several minutes, the Council's presiding officer, a towering insectoid being with glowing wings, raised a clawed hand for silence. Enough, it said, its voice resonating through the chamber. This matter requires further deliberation. The Council will reconvene tomorrow to discuss humanity's place among us. Thorne nodded slightly, stepping back from the podium as the session officially adjourned. Later, as he sat in his quarters aboard the Galactic Council station, Thorne stared out the window at the stars. He felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, the enormity of humanity's past, and the fragile hope of its future intertwining in his mind. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Calthavik standing in the doorway, his translucent skin glowing softly. Sergeant Thorne, the alien said, his voice gentle. May I join you? Thorne gestured to the empty chair. Sure. The two sat in silence for a moment, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars. Finally, Calthavik spoke. You have given us much to think about, he said. Your species is unlike any other we have encountered. Thorne chuckled dryly. I'll take that as a compliment. It is, Calthavik said earnestly. You remind us that even amidst chaos, there can be growth, and that perhaps We too have more to learn. Thorne nodded, feeling a small, flickering sense of hope. Maybe that's the whole point. The Galactic Council chamber was at capacity the next day. Every delegate who could attend was present, their expressions tense and unreadable. The session's topic, humanity's place within the Council, had attracted not just representatives, but also spectators from dozens of species. The air buzzed with anticipation, thick with the weight of an unspoken question. Could a species with humanity's history truly be trusted? Sergeant Jacob Thorne sat near the back of the chamber, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wasn't officially part of this session, but the presiding officer had invited him to speak again if the debate required clarification. That was code for damage control, and Thorne knew it. The discussion began civilly enough. Cal Thavik, ever the diplomat, stood to defend humanity. The fact that humans have rules for warfare is a testament to their self-awareness, he argued. Their willingness to confront their darkest moments shows growth, not malice. The Tinks delegate, her fur bristling with indignation, countered sharply. Growth? They created these horrors in the first place. The galaxy does not need their experiments in morality. A wave of murmurs rippled through the chamber. Ambassador Zorveth, stoic as ever, raised a massive hand for silence. If I may, he said, his deep voice commanding attention. The question is not whether humans are dangerous. They clearly are. The question is whether their danger is tempered by restraint. He turned toward Thorne. Sergeant, you have spoken of rules and accountability, but can you prove that humanity is capable of enforcing these principles even when it is inconvenient? Thorne rose from his seat, walking slowly to the podium. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, but he understood the stakes. His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Cal Thavik, who nodded encouragingly. I could give you statistics or historical examples, Thorne began, his voice steady. But instead, I'll tell you a story, a personal one. The room fell silent. It was my third deployment, Thorne said, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. We were stationed in a conflict zone on Earth, tasked with maintaining peace between two factions. One day, a junior officer in our unit broke protocol. He fired on civilians, claiming they were a threat. They weren't. Several delegates gasped, and Thorne felt the weight of their judgment. He pressed on. We could have buried it, he said. We could have lied, said it was an accident. But we didn't. We arrested him on the spot and handed him over to a military tribunal. He was dishonorably discharged and spent 20 years in prison. Thorne paused, letting the words sink in. Do you know what that did to our unit? It tore us apart. Morale plummeted. Some of us wondered if we'd done the right thing, turning on one of our own. But in the end, we knew it was necessary. Because if we don't hold ourselves accountable, no one else will. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Tinks delegate seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Cal Thavik, his translucent skin shimmering faintly, broke the quiet. Sergeant, your story is remarkable, but it also raises a question. What drives humanity to strive for such accountability, even at great personal cost? Thorne's gaze softened. Because we know what happens when we don't. We've seen the worst of ourselves, and we don't want to go back there. We fight for accountability because it's the only way we can live with ourselves. Ambassador Zorveth nodded slowly, his glowing eyes narrowing in thought. It seems, he said, that humanity is not merely a danger to others. You are a danger to yourselves as well. Thorne gave a small, humorless laugh. You're not wrong, Ambassador, but that danger cuts both ways. It's also why we fight so hard to be better. Because if we can survive ourselves, we can help others do the same. The presiding officer raised a clawed hand, signaling the end of the debate. Delegates, you have heard the arguments. We will now vote on humanity's place within the Council. Thorne returned to his seat, his chest tight. He had said all he could. Now, it was up to them. The voting process was agonizingly slow. Names of species lit up on the massive holographic display as delegates cast their votes. Thorne tried not to look, but his eyes kept darting toward the screen. Finally, the presiding officer announced the results. The majority has decided. Humanity will remain a member of the Galactic Council. A wave of relief washed over Thorne, though it was tempered by exhaustion. He knew the decision wasn't unanimous, far from it, but it was enough. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, Cal Thavik approached Thorne, his luminous eyes warm. "Sergeant, your words may not have swayed everyone, but they swayed enough." "Thank you." Thorne nodded. "Let's hope it was worth it." Later that night, as Thorne stared out at the stars from his quarters, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The galaxy now knew the truth about humanity, the good, the bad, and the brutal. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask.